On July 23, 2025, the same day its creators signed a $1.5 billion deal with the company that owns their show, South Park broadcast an episode in which Jesus Christ appeared in a public school because a media conglomerate had settled a lawsuit with the sitting president and needed to hand something over. The character of Jesus delivered his own punchline through clenched teeth. He said he did not want to be there. He said someone had backed down, and now the president could do whatever he wanted to anyone. The joke landed because the show had spent 27 years building up to it, one corrupt institution at a time. A Wall Street that decides trillion-dollar policy by letting a headless chicken run across a game board. A police force that joined the force to beat minorities and admits it openly. A religious organization that tried to silence a television program by using a stroke victim as a letter-writing puppet. A town that has been governed, policed, sued, medicated, censored, and bribed, and never once figured out who was doing it to them. Welcome to East Park. Let's get into it. The town that runs on deals, South Park, Colorado, is a small town. It has one elementary school, a main street, a community center that doubles as an emergency shelter whenever Randy Marsh convinces everyone the world is ending, and a city hall that has been governed by the same mayor for nearly 30 years without any visible improvement to anything she is responsible for. On the surface, it is the most ordinary place in the country, the kind of fictional American nowhere that exists specifically to hold a mirror up to the larger American somewhere. And underneath the surface, from the very first episode the show ever produced, it has been a place defined not by who votes, or who runs for office, or who wears the badge, but by who is cutting deals in the back room, and by how completely invisible those deals are to everyone living under them. The show did not begin with that idea fully formed. It began with alien visitors, and a boy who kept dying, and a small mountain town that served mostly as a canvas for the kind of jokes that could not be made anywhere else on television in 1997. But corruption was in the fabric from the beginning, woven into the architecture of the place, present in the behavior of its institutions, even when those institutions were mostly being used as backdrops. Mayor McDaniels appeared in the first season already fully assembled as the kind of official who says whatever the moment requires and believes none of it, who holds press conferences rather than meetings, who responds to every crisis by asking how it looks rather than what it costs. She is a graduate of Princeton who openly considers South Park a dump and its citizens an obstacle. She has had photographs with members of multiple presidential administrations on the wall of her office, which is the cleanest summary the show has ever offered of how local power actually works in America. It does not belong to a party. It belongs to whoever is holding the pen when the deal gets written. The show's original argument about power was a modest one. It was the argument that the people in charge are usually not the smartest people in the room, and that most institutions run on habit, self-protection, and the shared agreement to pretend the machinery makes sense. Officer Barbrady, the first law enforcement figure South Park introduced, was a man who could not read. This was not a background detail. It was the central fact of his character, and the show spent an entire season treating it as the town's most fundamental secret, the embarrassing truth at the heart of its only police department. South Park had been policed, for years, by an illiterate man who resolved situations by telling everyone there was nothing to see and driving away. The town had either not noticed or had decided, collectively, that asking questions was more trouble than it was worth. Both possibilities say the same thing about how South Park relates to the people who are supposed to protect it. What Barbrady represents in the show's longer argument about corruption is not venality. He is not taking bribes. He is not running schemes. He is simply an institution made flesh, a man who holds a position of authority without possessing any of the qualifications that authority is supposed to require, and who has held that position for long enough that questioning it no longer occurs to anyone. The corruption in Barbrady is the corruption of the unchallenged placeholder, the official who stays in his office because the system has no mechanism for asking him to leave. When the show finally revealed that he could not read, it revealed it through the most circuitous possible route, a string of chicken sexual assaults that could only be solved by a man capable of following written clues. The town did not discover that its police officer was illiterate because anyone checked. It discovered the truth because circumstances forced the truth out, and even then, the investigation was conducted mostly by 4 9-year-olds. That structure, the truth buried underneath a joke, forced out by accident rather than accountability, is the structure the show would use to examine corruption for the next 3 decades. South Park never builds its institutional satire around a whistleblower or a crusader or an investigative reporter. It builds it around the boys, who stumble into the truth of something because they are in the wrong place at the wrong time and have not yet learned to look away. The adults have learned, the boys have not, and that difference between the child who who still asks questions and the adult who has decided not to is the gap through which the show's deepest criticisms of power have always passed. Mayor McDaniels is the clearest institutional example of this because she has been in every era of the show, adapting and surviving and remaining in office without ever explaining why or how. The show's official description of her character notes that she is egotistical and thoughtless, privately contemptuous of the citizens she represents, willing to do anything to make a problem go away, hiding behind the children or a public debate whenever a real decision is required. She once left a microphone open during a ceremony for a visiting television personality and was overheard calling everyone in the town a word that cannot be repeated in polite company, a moment that was treated as an embarrassing gaffe rather than a disqualifying statement, because in South Park, the idea of a politician facing consequences for what she actually thinks has never been seriously entertained. She is the permanent face of local government in a town that has never once held a competitive election that the audience could see, which is itself a small joke about how municipal power tends to perpetuate itself in places where no one is watching. Her relationship with the police is the clearest example of how the town's different corrupt institutions lean on each other. When the Park County Police Force replaced Barbrady as the show's primary law enforcement presence, starting in the 7th season, the department it introduced was nakedly worse than the illiterate man it was replacing. Sergeant Yates, the new department's lead officer, would eventually acknowledge in plain terms that he and the other officers joined the force because it gave them legal license to beat minorities and that the arrangement was working fine until the public started to object. The admission is so blunt that it functions as a parody of the thing it is describing. The show does not accuse the department of systemic racism through insinuation or coded language. It simply has Yates say the quiet part out loud, in the same flat tone he uses to describe every other aspect of his work, because the point the show is making is not that this happens in secret. The point is that it happens in the open, and that the town finds ways to work with it anyway. The episode that demonstrated this most completely, a 19th season installment broadcast in November of 2015 and built around the show's response to real national debates about police violence, traced the full circuit of the arrangement with unusual care. Officer Barbrady, brought back for the storyline, accidentally shot a 6-year-old Latino boy after being sent into an ambiguous situation by PC principal, who had called a full police response because a student was talking during a school assembly. Barbrady was fired on the spot. The town, feeling righteous, organized a protest outside the police department, a protest that consisted largely of people drinking outside the building and insulting the officers, while a famous song about defunding the police played over a montage. The police, freed from obligation, decided they had no interest in helping the town with anything and turned their headquarters into a hula school. The rest of the episode is the show examining what the town actually wanted from that arrangement. The same residents who had been shouting outside the department's windows within the week came back, quietly, to ask if perhaps the officers could address the homeless population that had taken over the commercial district, which was threatening the Whole Foods store that had recently opened and around which the town had organized its entire sense of its own sophistication. The police agreed to return, on the condition that no one would watch when they did what they did to clear the area. The town accepted the condition. The cameras were turned off, the homeless were moved, and everyone went back to their routines. The corruption of that arrangement is the show's most honest picture of how municipal tolerance for police abuse actually functions. It does not persist because the public approves of it. It persists because the public finds the results useful and the cost invisible, and because every time accountability threatens to interrupt the deal offers the public something it wants more than accountability. The economy is another institution the show has treated as a form of organized deception, and the episode that said it most plainly aired on March 25, 2009, in the immediate aftermath of the global financial crisis that had begun the previous year. The episode was titled Margaritaville, and it was built around a single organizing metaphor that Parker and Stone had been working toward for months. Their argument, developed with the help of Stone's father, who works as an economist, was that the American public treats the economy the way it treats a religion. It does not understand how it works. It does not know who is in charge of it. It worships it when it is good and blames itself when it is bad, and performs rituals to appease it when it misbehaves, because performing rituals is the only response available to people who have no meaningful access to the system they are living inside. Randy, as usual, is the vehicle through which the show stages its most extravagant version of a thesis. He purchases a Margaritaville brand blender on credit while lecturing his family about the economic irresponsibility of buying things on credit, and then, convinced that the economy is punishing the town for its excess, founds a movement of radical radical austerity that turns South Park into something resembling a desert religious community from the ancient world. He strips away every convenience, preaches at his neighbors to reduce themselves to the bare necessities, and makes an exception for the blender because margaritas, he explains, are a bare necessity. The hypocrisy is the joke. The more serious argument lives in the subplot, where Stan tries to return the blender and discovers that returning it requires tracing a chain of financial instruments so complicated and so deliberately opaque that it leads him all the way to the United States Treasury, where men in suits make trillion-dollar decisions by decapitating a chicken and watching where the animal falls before it dies. The headless chicken scene is the most compressed statement the show has ever made about the relationship between ordinary people and financial power. Stan has spent the episode trying to find someone responsible, someone who owns the decision, someone to whom the blender and the debt attached to it ultimately belong. The chain he follows goes from retailer to finance company to Wall Street bank to the federal government, each link in the chain having packaged the original small obligation into something larger and sold it to someone further up the line, until the original debt has become a theoretical instrument worth $90 trillion, and the people nominally in charge of it are making their biggest decisions by letting a dying bird fall on a board game. The scene is absurd. It is also the most accurate satirical description of the 2008 crisis the show was capable of producing. The machinery of the financial system was not corrupt in the way that a bribed official is corrupt. It was corrupt in the way that a religion is corrupt, which is to say that it asked people to have faith in a process they were not permitted to understand, run by people who had arranged things so that the consequences of their decisions would land on someone else. Kyle is the one who understands this, the way Kyle always understands things in South Park. His role in the episode is to be the voice arguing that the economy is not a wrathful god requiring sacrifice, but a human construction that can be repaired by human choices, and the show gives him a genuinely thankless version of that role. He is right. He is also crucified for it, staged as a parody of the Passion narrative, absorbing the town's economic anxiety as a scapegoat. The episode ends with the economy recovering, the town happily spending again, and the news crediting the president with the rescue, cutting away before anyone has to explain what actually happened. Kyle, who did the actual work, is left staring at the television in disbelief. It is the show's standard conclusion for its most serious arguments about institutions. The truth gets worked out somewhere nobody is watching, and the credit for it is claimed by whoever was standing at the podium when the moment passed. The deepest thing Margaritaville said about corruption, the thing that separates it from the show's more pointed attacks on specific institutions, is that the system it was describing did not require bad actors to function as it did. Nobody in the Treasury Department was stealing. The people at the finance companies were not cartoon villains. They were professionals operating within a framework they had been handed, using tools they had been trained to use, producing outcomes that the framework was designed to produce, and that nobody with the power to change the framework had any incentive to change. The corruption of the financial system, as the show understood it, was the corruption of a design, built over decades by people who were not in the room anymore, producing damage that landed on people who had never been in the room at all. The headless chicken makes its decisions fairly, by the strict logic of the game board. The game board was built wrong. Nobody put it on trial. That gap between the rules of the game and the people forced to live by the outcome of the game is where South Park has always located its most serious argument about power. The corrupt politician and the biased cop and the dishonest businessman are all real, and the show has drawn all of them at various points in its run. But the deeper argument, the one the show returns to in its most ambitious episodes, is that the worst damage done by corrupt institutions is structural. It is baked into the arrangement before anyone sits down at the table. The town of South Park does not suffer because its individual officials are unusually wicked. It suffers because it has, across 30 years of its history, developed a relationship with its own institutions that looks exactly like the relationship between a patient and an illness they have decided to call a personality trait. The mayor is how it is. The police are how they are. The economy does what it does. Nobody put it that way deliberately, and nobody knows how to undo it. By placing all of this in a small, ordinary, cheerfully ugly mountain town, the show made the argument legible in a way that a more sophisticated setting would have obscured. South Park is not Washington, and it is not Wall Street, and it is not a prestige drama about the mechanics of institutional failure. It is a cartoon with a boy who keeps dying and a man who keeps causing disasters. And inside that cartoon, the show has quietly assembled one of the most sustained arguments in popular television about what corruption actually looks like when it is not in the form of a villain explaining his plan. It looks like a mayor who has been there so long nobody remembers running running against her. It looks like a police department that tells you exactly what it does and dares you to find a replacement. It looks like a treasury that uses a chicken to decide the fate of a generation's savings and then hands the credit for the outcome to someone who gave a speech. South Park built that argument one episode at a time, across every era of the show, without ever calling it an argument. It just showed the town running and let the audience notice what was making it go. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The show built its picture of corruption one institution at a time, starting with a mayor who governs by appearances and a police force that admits its own worst impulses out loud. Next, the focus moves to the part of that picture that lives behind a badge and what South Park really thinks about authority, from the first man who held it in the town to the department that replaced him and never managed to be better. Section 2. The Badge and what it covers. There is a moment in the 19th season of South Park, broadcast in November of 2015, where a senior police officer explains to the assembled adults of the town exactly why he and every other officer on the force joined law enforcement in the first place. He does not dress it up. He does not reach for a more acceptable version of the truth. He simply states that they joined because it gave them legal license to beat minorities, and that the arrangement had been working fine until the public started to object. The admission lands in the episode with no particular emphasis, delivered in the same flat procedural tone the character uses for everything, and the show lets it sit there without underlining it, because underlining it would suggest the audience needed help understanding what they just heard. They did not. The joke is not that Sergeant Yates said the quiet part out loud. The joke is that in South Park, the quiet part has never been very quiet, and the town has been finding ways to work around it for 30 years. The show's history with law enforcement begins well before Yates, in its very first season, with Officer Barbrady, who remains one of the most quietly devastating portraits of institutional failure the program ever drew. Barbrady's defining trait, as has been noted, was his illiteracy, but the more interesting thing about him is the way the show positioned that illiteracy within the social fabric of the town. He was not a man hiding his inability behind bluster or aggression. He was a man who had simply never been asked to prove he could do the job, because the town had organized its relationship with him around the assumption that someone in a uniform who arrived promptly and told everyone to move along was providing a service worth having. The surface of law enforcement was being maintained. The interior had been hollow the entire time. His defining catchphrase was a cheerful declaration that there was nothing to see here, delivered to witnesses of crimes, disasters, and genuine emergencies alike, accompanied by a shooing gesture that moved people on without requiring anyone to look directly at what had happened. The show used that catchphrase so consistently across its early seasons that it became a structural joke about the entire function of policing in the town. Barbrady was not covering up crimes because he was venal. He was covering them up because covering them up was the only tool he had. A man who cannot read cannot file a report. A man who cannot file a report cannot document what he saw. And so the investigation ends where it began, with the officer telling everyone to go home, and the town going home, and the thing that happened becoming a thing that officially did not happen. When the show eventually introduced the Park County Police Force in its 7th season, it kept the structural incompetence of the Barbrady era and added something considerably darker. The new department, led by Sergeant Yates, was portrayed from the beginning as actively rather than accidentally corrupt, a collection of officers whose institutional dysfunction was not a product of individual limitation, but of institutional design. They framed rich black men for crimes. They used excessive force casually and without consequence. They ignored genuine emergencies when responding to them might create accountability, and leaped enthusiastically into situations that allowed them to act with impunity. The Park County Police Force is the show's argument that the problem with law enforcement is not always incompetence. Sometimes the problem is that the institution is working exactly as the people inside it intended. The episode that brought both threads together, the Barbrady thread and the Yates thread, was the one from the 19th season already mentioned, titled Naughty Ninjas, and it is worth spending real time with because the argument it makes is more careful than it first appears. The inciting event is Barbrady being called to what is described as a code red emergency at the elementary school. He arrives at the back entrance as instructed, enters the gymnasium, and is immediately confused by PC principal shining a laser pointer in his direction. The confusion causes him to discharge his weapon, striking a 6-year-old Latino student in the shoulder. He is fired on the spot. Mayor McDaniels accepts no ambiguity about this. Barbrady is gone before the episode has properly begun. What follows is the show's most compressed examination of what a town actually wants from its police force, as opposed to what it says it wants. The residents organize a protest outside the department, genuinely outraged, genuinely energized. The protest takes the form of people drinking outside the building, shouting insults at the officers, spray painting the squad cars, and pushing shopping carts into officers' shins, while a famous song about distrust of law enforcement plays over the montage. The officers, rather than respond, simply withdraw. They are tired of being treated this way, and they are not entirely wrong to say so. They turn their headquarters into a hula school and wait. The town's satisfaction with this arrangement lasts exactly until something goes wrong in a part of the neighborhood that the residents care about. The homeless population, displaced from the area by Kenny and his friends' ninja game, has migrated to the commercial district and taken up residence outside the new Whole Foods market, which has become the symbol around which the gentrifying residents have organized their sense of who they are. The adults go back to the police. They go quietly, through back channels, without a press conference. They ask if perhaps the officers could take care of the homeless situation. Yates and his colleagues laugh at them, and then agree on a single condition: nobody will watch. When the adults accept the condition, the deal is closed, and the homeless are moved, and the Whole Foods reopens, and everyone returns to their routines, having agreed, formally and deliberately, to pretend that none of it happened. The condition is the whole argument. What the town wanted was not an end to police violence. What the town wanted was an end to police violence that it had to look at. The moment the violence was aimed at a population the town found inconvenient rather than a child the town found sympathetic, the moral clarity of the protest evaporated, and the same officials who had fired Barbrady in righteous fury were negotiating the terms under which the department would be allowed to do exactly what Yates had said, in plain terms, that it had always done. The show does not editorialize about this. It simply shows the sequence of events and lets the logic of that sequence make its own case. Barbrady's arc within the episode adds a layer that complicates the satire without softening it. After being fired, he goes home to his apartment, where the only living thing waiting for him is his elderly dog Barney, who requires medication he cannot afford without his salary. He tries to get a job at a fast food restaurant and is thrown out because the manager recognizes him as a former cop and no longer wants him on the premises. He ends up homeless himself, sleeping in the same district he used to patrol, his dog beside him, his career over. The episode is careful to give the audience this portrait alongside the portrait of the department's systematic racism, because the point it is making is not that every individual officer is irredeemable. The point is that the institution is, and that the institution does not protect the individuals inside it any more than it protects the individuals outside it. Barbrady joined the force because he loves to help and loves to be needed, which is among the most human things any character in the show has ever said, and that genuine desire to be of use got routed through an institution so structurally damaged that it came out the other end as a career of telling people there was nothing to see here. The show returned to this theme with a precision that bordered on formal in a third season episode called Lil Crime Stoppers, which aired in April of 2003 and which staged its argument in the form of a parody of police procedural dramas. The boys form a junior detective club, solve a few small neighborhood mysteries for $1 each, and are subsequently recruited by the Park County Police as junior deputies. The recruitment is played straight, the boys treated as genuine assets, and the work they are assigned escalates rapidly from missing toys to a strip club sting to a full-armed confrontation with the region's largest drug cartel. The joke is that the boys, armed with nothing but finger guns and the words bang bang, survive every firefight, while the actual criminals and several of the actual cops manage to destroy each other with astonishing efficiency. By the time the episode ends, the corrupt faction of the department has been eliminated, and the boys have been promoted. The promotion is the punchline, but the setup is the argument. The episode establishes early that many of the cops on the force are corrupt, that the corruption is known within the department, and that it is policed from the inside about as effectively as Barbrady policed the town from the outside, which is to say, not at all. The structural corruption of the institution is not hidden from the people inside it. It is simply accepted as a condition of employment, one of the features of the job that experienced officers factor into their work. And when the boys, with no training and no understanding of what they are walking into, stumble through the department's most violent confrontations and come out unscathed while the veterans around them fall, the show is making the same point it always makes about children navigating adult institutions. The innocence that makes them vulnerable is the same quality that keeps them clean. They have not been in the building long enough to become the building. Cartman's recurring use of law enforcement as a costume for his own impulses forms another thread in the show's argument about what the badge actually means. When Barbrady deputized the boys difficulties during the chicken lover storyline in the second season, Cartman's response to being handed a small amount of official authority was immediate and total. He mounted his big wheel, acquired a nightstick, and began patrolling the town, pulling over Randy Marsh for an alleged speeding violation and beating him in the street, while cameras from a real television program captured the whole thing. His famous demand for respect followed naturally from the situation, as though the badge had simply unlocked something that was already there, a conviction that authority is a license rather than a responsibility, that the point of the uniform is not to serve the person in front of you, but to compel their deference. The show presented this as a joke about a child's misunderstanding of what police work is. It also presented it as an unusually honest description of what police work has sometimes been in South Park and elsewhere. What the show has never done, across all of these portraits, is suggest that the solution is simple or that the people inside the institution are uniformly monstrous. Barbrady is genuinely kind and genuinely useless. Some of the Park County officers are racist, and some of them are merely negligent, and some of them are probably both, and neither quality prevents them from going home at the end of a shift and being someone's neighbor. The show's argument about law enforcement is not an argument about individual officers. It is an argument about what happens when an institution is given a monopoly on a specific kind of force, and what that monopoly tends to do to the people who hold it over time, and what it tends to do to the people over whom it is held. In South Park, those questions do not have tidy answers, and the show has never pretended they do. What it has done, across 30 years and through characters ranging from a genuinely illiterate man who loved his dog to a sergeant who admits his worst impulses in a single flat sentence, is refuse to let the badge itself stand in for an answer. The badge is not an answer. In South Park, the badge is where the questions begin. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The badge in South Park covers a great deal that the town would prefer not to examine. Next, the focus turns to a different kind of authority entirely, the kind worn not on a chest but on a collar, and to what the show discovered when it finally looked closely at organized religion and the institutions that claim to speak for something larger than themselves. Section 3. God, money, and the church of whatever works religion arrives in South Park the way most things arrive in South Park, loudly, without warning, and attached to someone who wants something. The show has never been hostile to faith in the private sense, the quiet personal conviction that something larger than the self exists and matters. What it has been consistently hostile to, across its entire run, is the institution that forms around that conviction and begins charging admission. The moment a belief system acquires a headquarters, a legal team, and a revenue model, South Park treats it as a subject for the same scrutiny it applies to any other organization that accumulates power while claiming to operate above it. The show has aimed that scrutiny at Christianity, Judaism, Mormonism, Islam, and a handful of smaller targets, but the most sustained and consequential battle it ever picked with organized religion was with Scientology, and that battle did not stay on the screen. It bled into the real world in ways the show had not quite anticipated, cost the program one of its most beloved cast members, and produced a confrontation between two competing ideas about what satire is allowed to say and who gets to decide. The episode at the center of all of it was the 12th episode of the 9th season, broadcast on Comedy Central on November 16, 2005, entitled Trapped in the Closet. The premise is that Stan, bored and looking for something to do, wanders into a Scientology center and takes their personality assessment. His results come back unusually high enough that the organization's leadership becomes convinced he is the reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of the church. Stan is welcomed as a prophet and a savior. He is told the central cosmological story of Scientology's upper levels, the account of the galactic overlord Xenu, and the frozen alien spirits deposited in Hawaiian volcanoes, and the show presents the story in a text box labeled, "This is what Scientologists actually believe," a presentation choice that strips away any ambiguity about what the episode is doing. It is not inventing the absurdity, it is reporting it. The episode also featured a joke involving a cartoon version of Tom Cruise, a prominent Scientologist, locking himself in Stan's closet and refusing to come out, a situation that various other characters, including John Travolta and R. Kelly, enter the episode to try to resolve. The closet joke was a double meaning the show made no effort to conceal, and it drew as much attention as anything else in the episode, but it was the theological section, the plain recitation of Scientology's founding mythology, that had the deepest consequences. The church had spent decades and significant legal resources protecting the details of its upper-level teachings from public exposure, arguing that the information was sacred and proprietary, and that revealing it without authorization caused genuine harm to those who encountered it unprepared. South Park simply put it on television, attributed it accurately, and moved on. The fallout was immediate, and it came from an unexpected direction. Isaac Hayes, who had voiced Chef, the school cook, and one of the show's most beloved recurring characters since the program's first episode in 1997, announced in March of 2006 that he was leaving South Park. His statement cited intolerance toward religious beliefs. He did not use the word Scientology in the statement, but the timing made the connection obvious, and Matt Stone's response made it explicit. Stone told journalists that Hayes had never raised any objection to the show's treatment of any religion in 9 years, and had cashed plenty of checks while the show mocked Christians, and that his objection had arrived precisely when his own faith was the subject. The double standard was the point Stone was making, and it was the same point the show itself was making in the episode, that a belief system which demands exemption from the scrutiny it is willing to apply to others is not making a theological argument, it is making a political one. What emerged later, through Hayes' son Isaac Hayes III, and through a memo that came to light years after the fact, was a more complicated and considerably darker picture. Hayes had suffered a stroke in January of 2006, leaving him unable to speak properly and in no condition to make independent decisions about his career. His assistants at the time were Scientologists. His management was connected to the church. The statement that quit the show on his behalf bore a remarkable resemblance in its phrasing to language the church itself had prepared in the immediate aftermath of the episode's broadcast. Isaac Hayes III said plainly in a later interview that his father did not quit South Park, that someone quit it for him, and that the decision forced a man still recovering from a neurological injury back onto the road to tour and earn income he would not have needed if the show had not been taken from him. The institution that claimed to represent his spiritual well-being had used his incapacity to make a professional decision in its own interest and presented it to the world as his choice. The show's response to Hayes' departure was to kill Chef, and to kill him in a way that made the circumstances of the departure impossible to ignore. Chef was portrayed as having been brainwashed by a cult called the Super Adventure Club, a thinly veiled stand-in for Scientology. His personality and his judgment dissolved by the organization's programming until he was unrecognizable as the man the audience had known. His death in the episode, which used recorded fragments of Hayes' previous performances to construct his final lines, was grotesque even by South Park standards, and it was designed to be. The show was not being cruel to Isaac Hayes. It was being precise about what it believed had happened to him, which was that an institution had gotten inside a man and operated him like a machine for its own purposes, while the man himself was no longer present to object. The Catholic Church received a treatment that was different in tone, but identical in its underlying logic. The show's portrait of institutional Catholicism centered not on theology, but on the administrative machinery that protected abusive priests, and it was delivered in an episode that sent the priest character, Father Maxey, to the Vatican to demand a change in church doctrine. What Maxey discovered there was not a group of wicked individuals conspiring to protect wrongdoing. It was a system so committed to its own continuity that the protection of wrongdoing had been encoded into it as a feature rather than a bug. The ruling authority of the church in the episode was rendered as a giant spider queen presiding over the preservation of doctrine, a creature whose only purpose was to prevent the rules from changing, regardless of what those rules were producing in the world outside the chamber. The monster is not malicious. It is institutional. It exists to maintain itself, and it maintains itself by making change impossible, which is also how the abuse continued for as long as it did. The Mormons received the most affectionate treatment of any organized religion in the show's history, and the affection is itself a kind of argument. An episode in the 7th season sent a Mormon family to South Park and built its story around the family's obvious warmth, their genuine love for one another, and their thorough decency as neighbors and human beings. The founding mythology of the faith, the story of Joseph Smith and the Golden Plates, was presented in the episode with the same factual plainness that the Scientology episode applied to Xenu, accompanied by a repeated musical refrain that the show used to mark each new element of the story as historically unlikely. The tension of the episode is between the beauty of what the family has built on the foundation of the belief and the implausibility of the foundation itself, and the show refuses to resolve that tension in either direction. The Mormon family is good. The story they believe may not be true. Both things are presented as real. The audience is left to decide whether the goodness requires the story or whether the story is beside the point. That ambiguity is the most honest thing South Park has ever said about religion, and it is notably absent from the show's treatment of Scientology. The difference is the difference between a faith and a business. The Mormon family in the 7th season is not extracting money from its members under threat. It is not using legal pressure to suppress questions about its history. It is not using a stroke victim as a letter-writing puppet to protect its interests. The warmth at the center of the family's life is real, and it is not contingent on anyone's silence. Scientology, as the show understood it, was contingent on silence. Its teachings were proprietary. Its members were graded and assessed and charged for access to the next level of understanding. Its response to criticism was not theological argument but legal threat. The show treated the two very differently because they were very different, and because the distinction between a community organized around belief and an institution organized around revenue is a distinction with real consequences for the people inside it. The Margaritaville episode made the argument that the economy functions as a religion, that its rituals and its demands for faith serve the same psychological purpose as prayer and sacrifice, while generating the same practical inability to question the people who administer the system. Trapped in the Closet made the inverse argument, that a religion can function as an economy, that an organization which charges for spiritual advancement and protects its teachings as intellectual property is not offering transcendence but selling it, and that the selling is indistinguishable from any other transaction in which the buyer hands over something real in exchange for something that may not exist. The two episodes are the show's matched pair on the subject of institutional faith, one about money behaving like a church and one about a church behaving like a business, and they reach the same conclusion from opposite directions. The corruption is in the claim that the institution operates above ordinary human accountability. The moment an organization makes that claim, South Park begins looking for what it is hiding behind it. The broader pattern across the show's treatment of organized religion is that the institutions which survive its scrutiny best are the ones that make the fewest claims to special authority. A faith that says, here is what we believe, and here is what it has done for us, and here is where you can find us if you want to join, is a faith the show treats with something close to respect. A faith that says, you may not question this, you may not publish this, you may not leave without consequences, and you will be paying at each stage of the journey, is a faith the show treats as any other racket. The collar does not change the analysis. The tax exemption does not change the analysis. The centuries of tradition do not change the analysis. What the show is always asking, underneath the jokes and the grotesque imagery and the musical numbers, is the same question it asks of every institution it examines, which is, who benefits from the arrangement as it currently exists, and who is prevented from asking that question? Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Organized religion in South Park wears many faces, and the show has learned to look past the face to the machinery underneath. Next, the focus turns to the largest and most persistent machinery of all, the government itself, and to the show's long and increasingly personal argument with the people who hold political power and the systems that keep them holding it. Section 4. The government and the joke that runs the country. Somewhere in the basement of the United States government, according to South Park, there is a room where the real decisions get made. The room has been depicted in different ways across the show's run, sometimes as a war room full of panicking generals, sometimes as an Oval Office occupied by a figure too dangerous or too absurd to be named directly, sometimes as a conspiracy so layered and so self-referential that the conspiracy itself has become the product. What never changes is the show's fundamental conviction about the people inside that room, which is that they are not smarter than they look, that the machinery of government is held together by the same mixture of self-interest, panic, and performed confidence that holds together every other institution in the show, and that the gap between what the government says it is doing and what it is actually doing is so wide that a child could fall through it and never be found. The show's political satire has always operated on two tracks simultaneously. The first track is the topical one, the rapid response commentary on specific administrations and specific events that South Park's production schedule makes possible. The show can turn an episode around in days, which means it can respond to a political development before the news cycle has finished processing it, and it has used that speed repeatedly across its history to land jokes that other programs could not have made in time to matter. The second track is slower and more durable, a structural argument about what government is and what it does and who it ultimately serves that runs underneath every specific satire the show has ever produced. The first track gets the attention. The second one is the argument. The structural argument was stated most plainly in an early season 2 episode, built around the boys receiving a class assignment to research current events. The episode, which introduced Tweek Tweek and his family's coffee shop, was ostensibly about corporate competition and whether large businesses are good or bad for a community. But nested inside it was a portrait of local government that the show would keep returning to for the next 2 decades. Mayor McDaniels, presented with a petition organized by a local businessman who had used the boys as unwitting props for his own commercial interest, immediately immediately moved to create a ballot proposition rather than make a decision herself. The proposition was called Prop 10. It existed to transfer the question from the mayor's desk to the town's voters, which transferred the responsibility from the mayor to the electorate, which meant that whatever the outcome, the mayor could not be held accountable for it. The mechanism was elegant, and the show presented it with the same cheerful contempt it applies to all elegant mechanisms of self-protection. The government had not solved the problem. It had organized a vote about the problem and called that governing. That instinct to manage the appearance of action without taking any runs through every level of government the show has ever depicted. The federal government version of it arrived in the show's treatment of the Bush administration, scattered across several episodes in the mid-2000s that engaged with the Iraq War, the response to Hurricane Katrina, and the broader atmosphere of institutional dysfunction that characterized the period. The show did not take sides on the war in any conventional sense. What it did instead was portray the government's management of public perception as itself a form of governance, a process in which the explanation of what was happening had become more important than what was actually happening, and in which the people nominally in charge had developed such sophisticated machinery for producing reassuring explanations that the machinery had become its own justification. A 10th season episode built around the conspiracy theories surrounding the September 11th attacks concluded not that the government had planned the attacks, but that the government had allowed the belief that it might have planned them to circulate, because a government capable of such an elaborate scheme seemed more competent and more in control than the actual government, which had simply failed to pay attention. The cover-up was not of a crime. It was of an embarrassing level of ordinary incompetence. The most sustained and structurally ambitious portrait of government corruption the show ever produced arrived not through a specific episode, but through a character, and the character was Mr. Garrison. Garrison had been the boys' teacher since the first episode of the first season, a man defined by his prejudices, his instability, and his tendency to use the classroom as a stage for working out his own psychological problems at his students' expense. By the 19th season, in 2015, Garrison had become something else entirely. Frustrated by an influx of Canadian immigrants into South Park and fired from his teaching job after reacting to them with open hostility, he began a political campaign built entirely on promises to remove the immigrants and build a wall to prevent more from arriving. The campaign was a deliberate parody of the early stages of Donald Trump's 2016 presidential run, and Parker and Stone designed it with the specific expectation that Trump's candidacy would collapse before the season ended, making Garrison a relic of a moment that had already passed. Trump won, Garrison became president, and the show was left with a satirical choice it had not planned for, a character who had been designed as a temporary joke, now occupying the permanent position of leader of the free world. The response Parker and Stone gave to that situation was one of the more honest, creative admissions the show has ever made. They allowed Garrison to hold the office while behaving with escalating desperation, trying and failing to get himself impeached, unable to stop the engine of his own election once it had started, trapped inside a victory he had not seriously sought and could not competently execute. The satire of Trump through Garrison was never really about Trump's specific policies. It was about the conditions that produced him, the way a political system sufficiently hollowed out by cynicism and sufficiently starved of genuine civic engagement becomes vulnerable to anyone willing to say out loud what the hollowness feels like, regardless of whether they have any intention of filling it. The show eventually retired Garrison from the presidency at the end of its 26th season, only for the actual Trump to return to the White House in January of 2025. Parker and Stone had said publicly that they were not sure what more they could possibly say about Trump and had expressed reluctance to return to the subject. The first episode of the 27th season, broadcast on July 23, 2025, answered the question of what they had left to say by saying it as directly as anything the show had ever produced. The episode was called Sermon on the Mount, a play on the word Paramount, which is the name of the company that owns South Park, and its central argument was about the relationship between political power and corporate cowardice. It aired the day after Parker and Stone signed a $1.5 billion deal with Paramount, a deal negotiated while Paramount was simultaneously settling a lawsuit brought by Trump against CBS's news magazine program 60 Minutes, canceling the late-night program hosted by one of Trump's most prominent critics, and seeking regulatory approval for a corporate merger from a government Trump controlled. The episode depicted Trump as a figure who had discovered that the threat of legal action was itself a form of governance, that a president with the power to sue and the willingness to use it could extract compliance from institutions without ever needing to win the lawsuits, because the cost of defending against them was high enough and the fear of what winning might cost was higher. Jesus Christ appeared in the episode as a character forced forced into public schools as part of the terms of a settlement between Paramount and the administration, delivering his lines through clenched teeth, telling the town to stop being stupid and settle, warning them what had happened to the network that had not settled quickly enough. The joke was that Jesus was not preaching, he was negotiating. The institution of the church had become, in this telling, another party to a deal, its most recognizable figure deployed as a term of agreement between a media conglomerate and a sitting president. The town settled for $3.5 million, agreed to produce pro-Trump public service announcements, and went back to their lives. What made the episode land harder than almost anything the show had produced in years was the specific timing of it. It aired while the deal that funded it was still being signed. The show was biting the hand that fed it on the same afternoon the hand extended itself, and doing so in an episode that was explicitly about what happens when institutions choose not to bite the hands that feed them. The parallel was not subtle, and the show did not want it to be. The Paramount of the episode, the company that had settled and capitulated and handed over a beloved cultural figure as a term of peace, was the same Paramount that had just written a check large enough to fund 10 more years of the program. The self-implication was total, and it was deliberate. The show acknowledging that it too existed inside the machinery it was describing, that the $1.5 billion and the freedom to make the episode were parts of the same transaction. That acknowledgement is the most mature thing South Park's political satire has ever done, and it marks a genuine evolution from the show's early approach to government, which tended to treat power as something that happened to the town from the outside. The later argument is that power is something the town participates in, that the corruption of government is not purely the government's corruption, but a corruption the governed have agreed to sustain by accepting its terms. The town of South Park settles with Trump, not because they have no choice, but because the alternative, standing firm while watching what happened to everyone else who stood firm, is a cost they are not prepared to pay. The government in South Park's later seasons is not a villain imposing itself on a helpless population. It is an arrangement that the population keeps renewing, one settlement at a time, because the arrangement offers just enough of what people want to make the cost of ending it feel too high. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The government in South Park runs on the threat of consequences and the willingness of institutions to pay to avoid them. Next, the focus turns to a different kind of power, the kind that does not wear a uniform or hold an office, the corporate power that the show has been examining since its second season and that has grown, across the run of the program, into something the town can no longer see around. Section 5. The Corporation and the Conscience. It doesn't have a second season episode of South Park, broadcast in December of 1998, sent 4 boys and a nervous, over-caffeinated classmate to a meeting with a group of creatures who lived underground and stole underpants. The creatures had a business plan. Phase 1 was collecting the underpants. Phase 3 was profit. When the boys asked what Phase 2 was, it emerged that there was no Phase 2. The gnomes had been working tirelessly toward a goal they could not describe, accumulating a resource they could not use, singing cheerfully while they did it. The episode was nominally about a corporate coffee chain threatening a local family business, but the gnomes were the part that lasted. Nearly 3 decades later, the image of a whiteboard reading Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3 profit has become one of the most durable pieces of satirical shorthand in popular culture, used to describe failed startups, hollow business strategies, and every venture that substitutes the energy of Phase 1 for the thinking required to get from there to somewhere real. What made the gnomes endure was the precision of the image. They are not lazy. They are not cynical. They work constantly, with great discipline and genuine commitment, toward an outcome they cannot articulate, because the articulation was never required and the work itself became the justification for continuing. That is the show's earliest and most concise statement about corporate behavior, the idea that an institution can be in perpetual motion without having any coherent idea of what it is building, and that the motion itself tends to generate the appearance of purpose, which is sufficient for the institution to keep going and to keep asking the people inside it to keep going alongside it. The coffee chain in the same episode, Harbucks, received a treatment that surprised many viewers then and continues to surprise people who encounter the episode for the first time now. Parker and Stone did not make the large corporation the villain. The small business owner, Mr. Tweak, was the one running a manipulation campaign, using the boys as unwitting props in a scripted presentation he wrote for them, appealing to the town's nostalgia and its suspicion of outside money to generate political pressure against a competitor that was, by the episode's own admission, making better coffee. The town rallied behind Tweak's family because the story Tweak told them was more emotionally satisfying than the truth, which was was that Harbucks had arrived because people wanted what it was selling. When Mrs. Tweek finally asked the assembled voters whether any of them had actually tasted the Harbucks product, the silence that followed was the episode's real punchline. The town had nearly passed a law banning a business based on a report written by someone who stood to profit from the ban, and nobody had thought to try the coffee. The episode is not a defense of corporate power in any simple sense. It is an argument about how corporate power gets contested, and about the degree to which the contestation often has less to do with the consumer than with the competing business interests that fund and organize it. Mr. Tweek was not protecting South Park from Harbucks. He was protecting his market share from a superior competitor and dressing the protection up as civic virtue. The show made that argument in 1998, and it has been making variations of it ever since, because the structure it described has not changed. The small business appeal, the local pride argument, the community values framing are all real and legitimate forces in how people relate to commerce, and they are also tools that can be picked up and used by anyone who needs them, including people whose interest in the community extends precisely as far as their bottom line. The show returned to corporate satire in a more expansive and considerably darker form across the later seasons, as Randy's marijuana enterprise gave it a vehicle that could carry a sustained argument across multiple years of episodes. Tigridy Farms began as a parody of artisanal lifestyle branding, a joke about a man who moved his family to the country and started preaching integrity while growing cannabis, the word Tigridy being Randy's mangled version of the virtue he most conspicuously lacked. What it became, across seasons 22 and 23 especially, was a portrait of how quickly a business organized around values captures those values and turns them into marketing. The episode that made this explicit, broadcast in the 23rd season's premiere in 2019, introduced representatives of a real marijuana retail company as characters who approached Tigridy Farms with a proposition. They had noticed Randy's campaign against home growing, which Randy had launched to protect his own sales, and they wanted to partner with him because they were fighting the same fight for the same reason. The scene in which Randy worked out what was being proposed was the episode's best moment. He named what they were doing without any apparent discomfort, calling it piggybacking on the goodwill of the legalization movement for some old-fashioned crony capitalism, and then immediately agreed to it. The joke was not that Randy was being corrupted by corporate contact. The joke was that the corporate logic had been Randy's logic all along, and that the only difference between Tigridy Farms and the company trying to buy into it was the flannel shirt. The Banned in China episode, broadcast in October of 2019, and the trigger for South Park's subsequent ban from Chinese internet platforms, took the corporate argument to its largest scale. The episode followed two parallel stories. Randy traveled to China to expand his marijuana business, and discovered that the Chinese market required compliance with rules that had nothing to do with commerce, and everything to do with political control. Stan's band attracted the interest of a music producer who wanted to make a biopic, and discovered that the biopic would need to be adjusted at every stage of production to satisfy Chinese censors, stripping out any element that the Chinese government found objectionable until the film contained nothing the boys recognized as their own story. The figure who held the two stories together was Mickey Mouse, depicted as the enforcer of Disney's relationship with China, appearing in scenes of rising tension to remind the characters that there was a market of 1.5 billion people, and that the price of access was the willingness to lower ideals of freedom. The line was delivered in the episode as reported speech, a crude formulation that a character stated as simple business logic, and it was the most direct the show has ever been about the specific transaction it was describing. Hollywood had, across the years preceding the episode, made a series of decisions that adjusted the content of American films to pass Chinese censorship, cutting references to homosexuality, removing unflattering portrayals of Chinese institutions, altering characters and storylines for the Chinese market, while presenting unaltered versions to Western audiences. The episode named What That Was. It was a trade, artistic freedom on one side, market access on the other. The studios had made the trade so many times and so quietly that it had stopped feeling like a trade and had started feeling like ordinary business. Stan's decision at the end of the episode was the show's moral anchor. He refused to alter his band's story for the Chinese market, said that anyone who made the other choice was worthless, and walked away from the deal. Randy, in the same episode, murdered a cartoon bear associated with a Chinese political meme to secure his own market access, and celebrated the integrity of the outcome. The contrast was the argument. The show had a position. It stated the position through Stan, who almost never states positions unless the show means them, and it dramatized the alternative through Randy, whose moral flexibility has always been the purest expression of what happens when appetite is allowed to organize a life. The healthcare special broadcast in 2024, titled The End of Obesity, brought the corporate argument into its most recent and most personal form. Cartman needs a weight loss medication that is genuinely available and genuinely effective. His family's insurance does not cover it. The episode that follows is a procedural tour of the American healthcare system's administrative machinery, conducted by the boys and rendered in the show's signature style of hyperbolically accurate absurdism. The insurance company's claims department is staffed by a single elderly man with a rotary phone and a typewriter, surrounded by towers of unprocessed paperwork, whose entire professional function consists of calling the medical director and relaying the director's single-word response. The word is no. The medical director's job is just to say no. The claims agent explains this without embarrassment, because within the logic of the institution he is describing, the explanation requires none. The villains of the special are the cereal mascots, breakfast brand characters who have formed a cartel to protect sugar sales against the threat that effective weight loss medication poses to their market. Captain Crunch and Tony the Tiger and their colleagues gather in secret and coordinate a strategy to suppress the drugs, working in collaboration with the insurance companies, who have their own financial reasons for denying coverage. The image of beloved childhood characters as the enforcers of a corrupt commercial arrangement was the episode's sharpest visual joke, and it was a joke with a long lineage in the show's treatment of corporations. Mickey Mouse as the enforcer of censorship, Colonel Sanders as a drug kingpin, the cereal mascots as a pharmaceutical cartel. South Park has spent 3 decades giving the friendly faces of commercial culture the jobs that the friendly faces are actually doing, which is protecting revenue streams. And the joke keeps working because the gap between the friendly face and the actual function keeps being real. The end of obesity ended without a solution, and the ending was the most honest thing about it. Kyle exhausted every available avenue, navigated every layer of bureaucracy, and reached the final authority in the system, only to be told that the system was not going to change, that the insurance companies and the food industry and the pharmaceutical companies all worked together, and that the working together was the point, and that the point was not the patient. The show did not offer an alternative. It did not suggest a reform or a workaround, or a character who had beaten the system and could show the boys how. It simply showed the system operating as designed and confirmed that the design was the problem. South Park does not usually end its episodes on a note of genuine defeat. The healthcare special did, because the subject required it, because the show had looked at the machinery of American corporate medicine and concluded that the appropriate response to seeing it clearly was not a punchline, but a long, flat silence where the punchline would have been. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The corporation in South Park wears many faces, and the show has spent decades pulling them off one at a time. Next, the focus turns to the media, to the institution that was supposed to be watching all the others, and to what happened when South Park looked at the press and found something that looked uncomfortably like a mirror. Section 6. The Media and the Mirror. Long before South Park had anything specific to say about journalism, it had already made its most fundamental argument about media by building Terrence and Phillip, the 2 Canadian comedians whose crude television program the children adore are, by the show's own account, a deliberate self-portrait, a version of South Park stripped down to its worst possible reading, a show that is nothing but the things its critics said it was. When the parents of South Park went to war against Terrence and Phillip in the first season, and again in the feature film, they were going to war against a media product, and the show was using that war to make an argument about the relationship between the audience, the content they consume, and the institutions that deliver and regulate that content. The media in South Park has never been a neutral conduit. From the beginning, it has been a participant, shaping what the town believes, amplifying what the town fears, and occasionally inventing what the town fears when the genuine article is not sufficiently frightening. The news media as an active force in the town's life became more prominent as the show matured, and the portrait it developed was consistent across every era. South Park's news broadcasts are staffed by anchors who report whatever is in front of them with equal gravity, whether that thing is a genuine emergency or a rumor or something a panicking townsperson said into a microphone 20 minutes ago. The news does not investigate, it amplifies. It takes the temperature of the mob and broadcasts that temperature back to the mob at higher volume, which raises the temperature, which gives the news something new to broadcast. The show understood this feedback loop early and has staged it in episode after episode. The media and the town locked in a cycle of mutual agitation that neither party could interrupt, because interrupting it would require one of them to stop performing, and performing is what both of them do. The fictional news reporters who appear throughout the run are almost uniformly interchangeable, distinguished only by their haircut shortcuts, and their ability to stand in front of developing situations and describe them with the confidence of people who have no idea what they are describing. They speak in the cadences of genuine journalism, the measured authoritative tone, the careful framing, the transition between segments that implies one story connects meaningfully to the next, and they use all of those cadences to convey information that is often wrong, frequently incomplete, and occasionally something a child made up. The show's point about television news is not that individual journalists are corrupt in the way that an official might be corrupt. It is that the format itself produces a particular kind of unreliability, that the requirement to fill airtime and to hold an audience and to deliver each piece of information with equal urgency, regardless of its actual importance, creates a medium that cannot distinguish between the significant and the trivial, and that the audience, having absorbed years of equally urgent reporting on equally varied events, has lost the ability to make that distinction either. The internet arrived in South Park and made everything worse, as it did everywhere else, and the show's treatment of online media is where the portrait of journalistic corruption gets its sharpest edges. Gerald Broflovsky's double life as an anonymous troll, documented across the 20th season, was explored at length in the earlier sections of this breakdown as an example of parental failure, but it is equally a piece of the show's argument about media. What Gerald discovered, and what the season built its arc around, was that the internet had created a publishing infrastructure with no editorial layer, no accountability mechanism, and no distinction between the person with something true and important to say and the person with nothing to say who wanted to watch someone suffer. Gerald's trolling was not journalism in any meaningful sense, but it occupied the same distribution channels as journalism and operated by the same attention economy, and the damage it did was real in the same way that the damage done by inaccurate reporting is real, arriving in people's lives as a felt injury, regardless of whether any institution intended it. The show's most formally constructed argument about media and truth arrived in the 19th season's extended storyline about advertising, which built across multiple episodes and concluded with a revelation that recontextualized the entire season. The storyline introduced Leslie, a student at South Park Elementary who PC Principal kept silencing during school assemblies, and spent several episodes developing the mystery of why she was being suppressed. The answer, when it came, was that Leslie was not a person, but an advertisement, a humanoid entity whose entire purpose was to deliver commercial messages, and that the conflict between PC Principal and Leslie was a conflict between two competing models of how information should flow through a society, one that at least nominally prioritized human content, and one that existed purely to move product. The season's larger argument was about the impossibility of distinguishing between genuine content and sponsored content in a media environment where the two had been deliberately blurred. The show depicted a world in which advertisements had become so sophisticated and so deeply embedded in ordinary communication that the audience could no longer identify which things they were being told came from a human perspective and which things came from a commercial interest wearing a human face. The news anchors in the season kept dying, replaced episode by episode, because the advertisements were eliminating anyone capable of producing genuinely independent information. What was left, once the independent voices were gone, was a media environment populated entirely by content that existed to sell something, delivered in a format indistinguishable from the format that used to carry news. That argument was abstract enough to function as satire, but grounded enough in real conditions to function as criticism. The years surrounding the 19th season saw genuine and sustained public debate about the relationship between editorial content and sponsored content on digital platforms, about the practice of native advertising, about the difficulty of identifying which online articles had been paid for by the subjects they described, about the degree to which social media feeds were delivering commercial messaging dressed as personal recommendation. South Park did not solve any of these problems. What it did was build a season around the experience of living inside them, the creeping disorientation of a media landscape in which every piece of information arrives already carrying someone else's agenda, and in which the agenda is the last thing the delivery system acknowledges. The Banned in China episode is the media argument's international chapter. Stan's band attracted a producer who wanted to make a film, and the film kept being altered by Chinese censors standing on set, literally erasing passages from scripts as they were being written, until the story the band wanted to tell had been replaced by a story the Chinese government was willing to permit. Stan's observation that he now understood how Hollywood writers felt was a joke with a long sourcing document behind it. The show had been watching the American entertainment industry adjust its content for the Chinese market for years, watching major studios remove references to homosexuality, watching comic book adaptations alter characters, watching historical dramas modify their accounts of events the Chinese government preferred to present differently. The adjustment happened gradually and quietly enough that each individual change could be rationalized as a minor creative decision, and the cumulative effect, a body of popular culture shaped by the preferences of an authoritarian government, was visible only if you looked at all of the changes together. The show looked at them together, and what it saw was a media industry that had traded its editorial independence for market access so incrementally that it no longer experienced the trade as a trade. The studios were not being censored in any dramatic sense. They were making choices, voluntarily, to produce content that would be permitted in a market they wanted. The distinction between that and censorship is a distinction the show treated with considerable skepticism, because the outcome for the audience is identical. A film that removes its depiction of a gay relationship to satisfy a government that criminalizes homosexuality is a film that has been shaped by that government, regardless of whether anyone held a gun to the director's head. The media institution that makes that film has made a choice, and the choice has a name, and the name is not creative compromise. The Sermon on the Mount episode brought the media argument home in a way that the show had never quite managed before, because it put South Park's own network, its own parent company, and its own distribution infrastructure inside the frame. The episode depicted the 60 Minutes news magazine program, which airs on a network owned by the same company that owns Comedy Central, with its hosts delivering reporting through visibly clenched teeth, qualifying every sentence, adding reassurances about the greatness of a president who had sued the network into a settlement before the cameras rolled. The stopwatch logo of the program had been replaced, in the episode's version, with a time bomb. The hosts were not lying exactly. They were performing the kind of carefully managed honesty that is available to journalists who work for institutions that have already agreed to certain limits. The honesty that reports accurately on the things it is permitted to cover and does not acknowledge the things it is not. The joke was not about 60 Minutes specifically. It was about what journalism looks like when the institution that carries it has signed a deal that constrains it, and about how indistinguishable that journalism looks from the outside from journalism that has not signed any deals at all. The audience watching the clenched teeth broadcast in the episode cannot tell from the broadcast itself that the broadcast is constrained. The constraint is invisible in the product. It is visible only in the gap between what the product contains and what the audience knows to be true about the situation being reported, and filling that gap requires the audience to have access to information the broadcast is not providing. The media cannot help the audience fill that gap if the media is the reason the gap exists. The show placed itself inside that argument by broadcasting it on a network owned by a company that had just paid to make the argument possible. The $1.5 billion deal and the episode that mocked the deal were released on the same day, and the simultaneity was the most precise thing the show has ever done about the media, including about itself. South Park is a media product. It is funded by a corporation. It exists within the same economy of deals and settlements and market access that it spends its seasons describing. The show knows this and has always known it, and the Sermon on the Mount episode was the clearest acknowledgement it has ever made that knowing something about a system does not place you outside the system. The boys see the corruption. The show sees the corruption. Everyone inside the frame is still inside the frame. Seeing clearly in South Park has never been the same thing as being free. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The media in South Park watches everything and changes nothing, constrained by the same deals that constrain every other institution in the town. Next, the focus shifts to the show's most intimate portrait of institutional failure, the school, and to what happens when the place designed to teach children how to think becomes the place where thinking is most thoroughly discouraged. Section 7, the school and what it teaches. South Park Elementary has been operating for nearly 30 years and has never once produced a child who learned something useful inside a classroom. This is not an oversight. The show has been deliberate about it, building the school as an institution that exists primarily for the comfort and employment of the adults inside it, rather than for the education of the students nominally entrusted to it. The teachers are disasters. The counselors are ineffective. The principals cycle through the building, leaving damage behind them, each one arriving with a mandate to fix what the last one broke, and departing having broken something new. And the boys who sit in the desks at the front of the room absorb essentially nothing from the formal curriculum while learning, through the chaotic experience of simply being in the building, a great deal about how institutions actually work, which is perhaps the most honest version of what a school can offer. Mr. Garrison is the figure around whom the show built its earliest and most sustained portrait of educational failure. He has been the boys' teacher since the first episode of the first season. First and third grade grade and then in 4th, and the consistency of his presence across the show's history is itself a joke about tenure, about the difficulty of removing a person from a position once the paperwork of employment has been completed. Garrison has, across the run of the series, used a hand puppet to voice his own repressed psychological states, conducted lessons on almost no relevant academic content, openly favored students he liked and punished students he did not, and worked through every major personal crisis of his adult life in front of a classroom of 9-year-olds who had been sent to school to learn arithmetic. The school board's response to Garrison across the early seasons was a recurring bit that always ended the same way, with some authority figure threatening consequences that never arrived, because the machinery of educational employment was not designed to produce consequences. It was designed to produce paperwork, and Garrison had always been better at generating paperwork than the people trying to remove him. The show introduced a school counselor, alongside Garrison, in the first season, a man named Mr. Mackey, whose defining characteristic was his inability to help anyone with anything while maintaining an absolute conviction that he was helping. Mackey's catchphrase, "The information that drugs are bad," delivered with a verbal tick that the show turned into his most identifiable feature, is the perfect distillation of what the show thinks institutional counseling is for. It is not for the student. It is for the institution, which needs to be able to demonstrate that a concern was raised and addressed, that a professional was consulted, that the appropriate language was deployed in the appropriate setting. Whether the student left the session better equipped to navigate whatever brought them there is a question the institution does not have a metric for, and therefore, a question the institution does not ask. Mackey raised the concern. Mackey said the thing. The file was updated. The school had done its job. The crisis that arrived in the first season around Mackey's supply of drug samples illustrated the point with the show's characteristic efficiency. Mackey brought marijuana to class as a demonstration tool for an anti-drug lecture. The drug went missing, and rather than report its absence to a higher authority, Mackey spiraled into a personal catastrophe that ended with him experimenting with drugs himself, losing his job, and living on the street. The episode was primarily a parody of anti-drug messaging and its unintended effects, but underneath the parody was a portrait of an institution so poorly designed that its designated professional for addressing student drug problems was one misplaced sample away from becoming a cautionary tale. The school's drug counselor could not protect himself from drugs. The school's drug policy had no mechanism for noticing this until he was already gone. The institution had a program for drugs. What it lacked was anyone paying attention to whether the program worked. PC Principal arrived in the 19th season, and the school has not recovered from his arrival. The character was introduced as a parody of a specific kind of institutional progressivism, the variety that is more interested in the performance of correct values than in the application of them, that treats language policing as equivalent to social change, and that enforces its standards with a physical and administrative aggression entirely at odds with the gentleness it claims to embody. PC Principal's first action upon becoming principal of South Park Elementary was to tackle Cartman to the ground and beat him for using an outdated term, an act of violence carried out in the name of sensitivity, and the joke of his entire character is that the contradiction never registers for him. He has been made the enforcer of a value system without having been given, or having sought, any understanding of what the value system is for. The show used PC Principal to make an argument about institutional progressivism that was more careful than it is sometimes given credit for being. The argument was not that the values PC Principal enforces are wrong. It was that enforcement is the wrong relationship to values, that an institution which demands correct language and punishes incorrect language is not producing people who understand why the language matters. It is producing people who know which words to avoid in front of authority. The distinction is the whole argument. A school that makes certain expressions punishable does not change what students think. It changes what students say, and it changes it only in the presence of the authority capable of enforcing the punishment, and it teaches the students, very efficiently, that the institution is watching their surfaces and cannot see anything underneath. The logical conclusion of PC Principal's approach to education arrived in the episode where he called in a full police response because a student was talking during a school assembly, describing the situation to the dispatcher as a code red emergency. The student was Leslie, and the situation was a girl having a quiet conversation, and the police arrived in riot gear, and the subsequent chaos ended with a child being shot. PC Principal's response to authority was identical whether the situation required it or not. He had one tool, which was the escalation of institutional force, and he applied it with the same confidence in every situation, because the confidence was not a product of judgment, it was a product of the position. The principal of a school has the authority to call the police. The fact that the authority exists made made its use, in PC Principal's framework, self-justifying. The school's relationship with the parents of its students has been a recurring engine of the show's educational satire, and it runs in both directions. The parents use the school as a proxy for their own anxieties, demanding that the institution manage whatever aspect of their children's lives they find most alarming, and the school responds by generating programs and policies that address the anxiety without addressing its source. When the parents worried about violence, the school organized awareness campaigns. When they worried about drugs, the school brought in Mackey. When they worried about language, the school brought in PC Principal. None of these responses engaged with the actual children. They engaged with the parents' experience of worrying about the children, which is a different thing entirely and requires a different intervention, one that no school in South Park has ever been equipped to offer, because the school is not designed to serve children. It is designed to serve the community's idea of what childhood should look like. The episode that made this argument most directly was built around a visit from a famous child psychologist or a child-rearing expert, a rotating category of authority figures the show brings into the school whenever it wants to examine what happens when professional credentials encounter a situation that professional credentials cannot fix. The format is always the same. The expert arrives with a framework. The framework encounters Cartman. Cartman dismantles the framework, not because he is smarter than the expert, but because the framework was designed for a different problem than the one Cartman presents, and the expert cannot adapt because adapting would require abandoning the framework, which would require abandoning the credential, which is the only source of authority the expert brought into the room. The school invited the expert. The expert cannot help. The school thanks the expert and invites the next one. The institution keeps itself busy responding to Cartman, and Cartman keeps himself busy defeating the responses, and nothing changes, and no child in the building learns anything that will be useful to them later. The standardized testing machinery that the show examined in a fourth season episode exposed another layer of the institution's priorities. The episode built its story around the school's response to upcoming standardized tests, tests that would determine funding levels and public rankings, and the career prospects of the administrators responsible for the results. The boys were coached not in the material the tests covered, but in the techniques for taking the tests, the strategies for eliminating obviously wrong answers, and managing time and selecting confidently between options that were not clearly distinguishable from one another. The distinction between knowing something and knowing how to perform knowing something on a multiple choice instrument was the episode's subject, and the school's total comfort with the latter at the expense of the former was the institutional corruption it was identifying. The tests were not measuring education. They were measuring the school's ability to prepare students for the tests, and the school had organized itself quite efficiently around producing that specific result, which had nothing to do with what the tests were nominally for. Tweak's presence in the school provided the show with its most consistent portrait of what the institution does to its most vulnerable students. Tweak is anxious, overcaffeinated, and genuinely struggling with a level of stress that would concern any adult paying attention. The school has never paid attention. He sits in the same desks as the other boys, receives the same non-instruction from the same rotating cast of inadequate adults, and navigates his anxiety without any institutional support because the institution's support systems are designed for the average student, whoever that is, and Tweak is not that student. His parents, who are feeding him excessive amounts of coffee and possibly, by the implications of a later game adaptation, something considerably stronger, have never been meaningfully engaged by the school about what is happening to their son, because engaging the parents would require the school to have noticed something, and noticing things is not in the institutional job description. The school sees Tweak, it does not observe him. The distinction is the same one that runs through all of the show's institutional satire, the gap between the performance of function and the execution of it. The guidance the boys have actually received across the run of the show, the knowledge that has genuinely shaped them, and the understanding that has helped them navigate the world has come almost entirely from outside the school. It has come from their own experiences, from the disasters they walked into and walked back out of, from the adults in the town who occasionally said something true by accident, from each other. Kyle's moral seriousness was not produced by Mr. Garrison's classroom. Stan's clarity about his own situation was not the product of Mr. Mackey's counseling. Kenny's understanding of how to protect someone smaller than himself did not come from any program the school offered. The school was the place they went every day, and it shaped them the way any unavoidable institution shapes the people inside it, by teaching them how to move through it without being consumed by it, which is a skill and a real one, but not the skill the institution claimed to be providing. What the show has built, across 30 years of the school's operation, is a portrait of an institution that has successfully decoupled its existence from its stated purpose. South Park Elementary elementary exists. It has a building, a budget, a staff, a principal, a counselor, and a set of policies for managing every conceivable situation except the education of children. It generates reports and holds meetings and sends notes home and organizes assemblies and calls in experts and deploys programs and does all of this with considerable energy and without producing any evidence that any child in the building is learning anything the building was supposed to teach them. The corruption of the school is not financial or personal or even particularly dramatic. It is the corruption of purpose drift, the slow and invisible process by which an institution forgets what it was built for while continuing to operate all the machinery that was built to accomplish it. The lights are on, the desks are full, the bell rings at the same time every day, and the boys who sit in those desks learn, mostly, how to survive the building, which is the lesson the building had available and which turns out to be the lesson they needed most. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The school teaches survival and calls it education, which is more honest than it sounds. Next, the focus turns to the entertainment industry itself, to Hollywood and the culture machine that South Park has spent its entire existence both belonging to and attacking, and to what the show discovered when it looked at the business of making the things people love and found the same arrangements it found everywhere else. Section 8. Hollywood and the price of the ticket. There is a version of South Park that could have spent its entire run celebrating the entertainment industry. Parker and Stone built the show from almost nothing, on a budget that initially required them to animate everything by hand from construction paper, and watched it become one of the most financially successful animated programs in television history. They signed deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They wrote a Broadway musical that won 9 Tony Awards. They built a production company whose technology has been used across the film and television industry. By any measure, Hollywood treated them extraordinarily well, and there are creators who respond to that treatment with a loyalty that shapes what they are willing to say about the business that made them. Parker and Stone responded differently. They spent the show's entire run examining the entertainment industry with the same cold eye they turned on everything else, and what they found there was the same thing they found in the government and the church and the police department, which was an institution that generates enormous amounts of money and cultural authority while remaining almost completely unaccountable for how it uses either. The show's earliest and most sustained attack on Hollywood was aimed not at the industry's content, but at the celebrity culture that surrounded it. The series established early that famous people in South Park existed primarily as objects of the town's appetite for proximity to fame and as forces that could, when the town's appetite threatened to become a nuisance, retaliate with enormous legal and commercial resources. The 200th and 201st episodes, a 2-part storyline broadcast in the 14th season, gathered essentially every celebrity the show had ever mocked into a single plot and had them collectively sue the town of South Park for defamation. The lawsuit was existential. The town was facing a settlement so large that compliance with whatever the celebrities demanded was the only alternative to financial ruin. The episode was, among other things, a self-portrait of the show's relationship with the people it had been drawing for 13 years. An acknowledgement that the freedom to mock the famous is not free, that it exists within a commercial and legal landscape that the famous have the resources to reshape. The entertainment industry's relationship with China was the subject the show pursued most seriously, and the Banned in China episode was where the pursuit was most focused and most costly in real terms. The episode aired in October of 2019, and within days, South Park had been comprehensively erased from the Chinese internet. Every clip and episode and fan discussion removed from every platform, a removal so total that it required active coordination at the institutional level. Parker and Stone's response was to publish a mock apology that said, with cheerful precision, that like the NBA, they welcomed the Chinese censors into their homes and into their hearts, that they too loved money more than freedom and democracy, and that the removal was fine by them. The apology was not an apology. It was the show stating its position in the language of the thing it was criticizing, demonstrating the form of capitulation it was refusing to perform. The specific target of the Banned in China episode within the entertainment industry was the way major studios had normalized a practice that, described plainly, was allowing a foreign government with no democratic accountability to influence the content of films made for a global audience. This had happened gradually, through a series of individual decisions that each seemed minor in isolation and that accumulated into a systematic reshaping of what American popular culture was willing to say. A studio adjusting a sequel's jacket artwork to remove a flag patch, a remake switching the nationality of its villains from Chinese to North Korean, Korean before production began, a major franchise removing a gay relationship from its international cut. Each decision was made by someone in a room somewhere, on grounds that probably involved a spreadsheet and a market projection, and none of the decisions announced themselves as censorship because none of them were presented as demands. They were presented as choices, and they were choices made freely by institutions that had decided the price of making them was lower than the price of not making them. Stan's refusal at the end of that episode, his decision to walk away from the deal rather than continue altering his band's story to satisfy requirements he had not agreed to and could not fully see, was the show's statement about what the alternative looked like. The show presented the alternative as available. It was not naive about the cost. Stan walks away from real money and real distribution and a career that the producer was going to make happen. The episode does not suggest the walk was easy or that it produced any particular reward. It suggests that the alternative to the walk was worse, that the thing lost by staying and complying was something that could not be recovered once it was gone, and that Randy's willingness to murder a cartoon bear for market access represented the endpoint of the logic of compliance, the place you arrived if you followed the industry's reasoning all the way to its conclusion. Mickey Mouse as the enforcer of Disney's relationship with Chinese censors was the episode's most concentrated image, and it worked because of what Mickey Mouse represents in the broader culture. The character is among the most recognized images in the world, the embodiment of a particular idea of wholesome American entertainment, the face of a company that has spent a century building a brand around the proposition that it makes things that are good for families and good for children. Placing that character in the role of the person who explains, with calm corporate authority, that compliance with authoritarian censorship is simply the cost of doing business in the Chinese market was the show's way of saying that the brand and the behavior are not the same thing, that the wholesome face and the commercial calculation behind it coexist without difficulty in the executive suite of the entertainment industry, and that the face was always primarily a commercial asset rather than a moral commitment. The show had made a version of this argument before, in the Colonel Sanders storyline that ran through the episode dealing with the closure of South Park's Kentucky Fried Chicken location. The Colonel, dead since 1980, but still deployed as the living face of the franchise in its advertising, appeared in the episode as a living criminal operating a fast food black market from a South American compound surrounded by armed guards and product to be moved through channels that bypassed the local regulations that had closed his legitimate outlets. The joke depended on the audience's recognition of the gap between the folksy grandfather image the company had built around its founder and the hard commercial logic that had made the company what it was. The Colonel on the advertising is a warm reassurance. The Colonel in the episode is a business person who will use whatever means are available to keep the product flowing. South Park's consistent argument is that these are not contradictory portraits. They are sequential ones, the reassurance in front and the logic behind it. And the entertainment industry has always understood this better than any other business because the entertainment industry invented the technique. The Scientology episode's collision with the entertainment industry was where the show's argument about Hollywood became most personal because the collision produced a real casualty in the real world. Tom Cruise, John Travolta, and other celebrity Scientologists were depicted in the episode, and the aftermath included credible reports that Cruise's leverage with the studio that distributed South Park's parent company's products was used to pressure Comedy Central not to rebroadcast the episode. The rebroadcast was pulled, replaced by a tribute to Isaac Hayes after his departure, and Parker and Stone were publicly certain about what had happened, even if the specific mechanism remained deniable. A celebrity had used commercial relationships to constrain what a television network was willing to air, and the network had complied, and the compliance had been dressed up as something else. A tribute, a scheduling decision, a coincidence of timing. The entertainment industry did not call it censorship. The entertainment industry never calls it censorship. It calls it a decision, made for reasons it declines to specify, and it moves on. The Broadway musical the show produced, which opened in 2011 and ran for years to extraordinary commercial and critical success, was itself a piece of the argument about the entertainment industry, though it made the argument by example rather than by satire. The Book of Mormon was a show about missionaries, about faith, about the gap between what a belief system promises and what it delivers, about the relationship between sincere conviction and the cultural forms that conviction takes. It won 9 Tony Awards and became one of the highest grossing productions in Broadway history, which meant that the people who ran the entertainment industry rewarded Parker and Stone very handsomely for making it. The Mormon Church did not respond with lawsuits or pressure campaigns. It took out advertisements in the playbill. The contrast with the Scientology response to the television episode was a contrast the show did not need to make explicitly because the two responses illustrated the argument on their own. An institution secure enough in its actual relationship with its members does not need to suppress the satire. An institution whose authority depends on controlling the information available to its members does. The show's later seasons placed the entertainment industry inside the corruption argument in a more diffuse and more contemporary form, through the extended exploration of how content creation, social media performance, and the monetization of personal life had blurred the line between the entertainer and the entertainment. Randy's various online ventures, his marijuana brand marketing, his brief period as a content creator in the adult entertainment space, his Lord persona, all of these were portraits of a man who had discovered that the entertainment industry no longer required a studio or a record label or a network to participate in. The infrastructure for distributing content had become available to anyone with a phone and a willingness to perform, and Randy was constitutionally incapable of not performing, which meant the new entertainment landscape was designed for him in ways the old one had not been. The show's argument about the new entertainment economy was embedded in what Randy's various ventures did to the people around him. His children were mortified by his content, his wife was displaced by his personas, his community was subjected to whatever he was producing this season, without having agreed to participate in any of it. The entertainment industry had always extracted something from the people adjacent to the people it celebrated, the families and the communities and the ordinary lives that provided the raw material for the performances, but the new version of the industry made the extraction more literal and more constant. Randy could not be a pop star in secret forever, and he could not run a marijuana brand without conscripting his family into it, and he could not create online content without the content touching everything and everyone the content was made from. The entertainment industry in South Park's later seasons is not a place you go to. It is a thing that comes to you, and the coming of it changes the shape of whatever it finds when it arrives. What Hollywood represents in the show's long argument about corruption is the institution that most effectively naturalizes the arrangements that other institutions try to hide. The government uses legislation, the church uses theology, the police use force, the entertainment industry uses entertainment, which is to say, it uses the thing that people want, and it delivers that thing wrapped around the commercial and ideological content it needs to move, and the delivery is so pleasurable that the wrapping tends to go unexamined. South Park is aware of this because South Park is part of it. The show's self-awareness about its own position within the industry has become more explicit across its later years, and the Sermon on the Mount episode made it fully visible, the show acknowledging that it too is a product, funded by a corporation, distributed through channels that have their own interests, and that the freedom it has exercised within that system is real but not unlimited, and that the limits were agreed to by people in rooms the audience never sees, in deals that were announced as business arrangements rather than editorial ones. The entertainment industry taught South Park how to see corruption. It also taught the show that seeing corruption and being outside it are not the same achievement, and that the most honest thing a show built inside the machine can do is say so. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Hollywood makes corruption entertaining and calls that a service, which is the most efficient version of the arrangement South Park has ever described. Next, the focus turns to the show's argument about the people who are supposed to push back against all of this, the citizens, the voters, the ordinary residents of a small Colorado town, and to what happens when the accountability that institutions require turns out to be something the public is not especially interested in providing. Section 9. The citizens and the corruption they choose. Every institution in South Park requires the participation of the people it governs in order to function. The government needs voters. The police need a community willing to call them. The church needs a congregation. The corporation needs consumers. The media needs an audience. None of these institutions could sustain their worst behavior for a week if the people living underneath them decided, collectively and seriously, to withdraw that participation. The show has understood this from its earliest seasons and has built it into the architecture of every corruption story it has ever told. The real villain in most South Park episodes is not the official or the executive or the institution. It is the ordinary resident of the town, the person who keeps the arrangement going not through any dramatic act of complicity, but through the far more durable mechanism of simply not paying enough attention to notice what the arrangement is costing them. The adults of South Park are not bad people in any concentrated sense. Taken individually, most of them are recognizable, even sympathetic, the kind of people who exist in every community and who, given the right circumstances, would probably make reasonable neighbors. Gerald Broflovsky is a lawyer who coaches his son's sports teams and attends parent-teacher conferences. Randy Marsh loves his family and means well in the specific moments when meaning well is easy. Mayor McDaniels went to Princeton and presumably had ambitions once that extended beyond the management of a town that she considers beneath her. The people of South Park are not monsters. They are people who have made a series of small decisions across a long stretch of time to accept things as they are rather than engage with what they actually are, and the accumulation of those small decisions has produced the town the show keeps returning to, season after season, with its corrupt police and its captured government and its institutions that serve themselves while claiming to serve everyone else. The show has a specific and recurring mechanism for demonstrating this accumulation. It is the town meeting, the gathering of South Park's adults in the community center or the school gymnasium or outside the police department, where the public theoretically exercises its collective judgment about how the town is run. The town meetings in South Park are extraordinarily well attended. The adults show up in force, passionate and vocal, and prepared to make their feelings known. And what they do at those meetings is perform the act of civic engagement without producing any of its results. They shout, they vote on propositions that the mayor has organized specifically to absorb their energy without binding her to anything consequential. They form committees, they draft resolutions, they elect temporary representatives to carry their concerns to the relevant authorities, and the representatives arrive at those authorities and are either ignored or absorbed, and the adults go home having done their civic duty and changed nothing, and the town keeps running on the arrangements that were in place before anyone showed up to object to them. The molestation panic episode in the 4th season was the show's most explicit demonstration of how the public's civic energy can be turned against itself. The boys discovered that accusing an adult of molestation produced an immediate and overwhelming institutional response. The adult removed from the situation without investigation or due process. The machinery of child protection operating at full speed on the basis of an accusation alone. Armed with this knowledge, the boys used it to remove every inconvenient adult from their lives in rapid succession, and the adult population of the town was largely incarcerated before anyone thought to examine whether the accusations were credible. The episode is a parody of a specific kind of institutional credulity, the eagerness to demonstrate concern by acting immediately and visibly, regardless of whether the action is proportionate or accurate. But underneath the parody is a portrait of the public that is harder on the audience than it is on any official. The adults of South Park surrendered their neighbors to institutional custody on the word of children without verification, because verifying would have required the kind of skeptical engagement with a serious accusation that felt, in the moment, like the wrong posture to take. The wrong posture was more comfortable than the right one. The adults chose it. And when the town was empty of grown-ups and the children were left to govern themselves, the children lasted about 48 hours before the community descended into tribal warfare, which was the show's equally bleak assessment of what happens when the public's desire to be free of its institutions is actually granted. The institutions are bad. The alternative is worse. The public is trapped between these two facts and has been coping with the trap in South Park by pretending that neither of them is quite as true as it appears. The smugness episode in the 10th season addressed a different version of the same failure, the failure of the progressive citizen who has solved the problem of civic engagement by replacing it with a feeling. Stan's father, Randy, in that episode purchased a hybrid car and became so satisfied with himself for doing so that the satisfaction itself became a physical contaminant, a cloud of smug that spread across the town and ultimately threatened to merge with a similar cloud produced by the city of San Francisco into a storm that would destroy everything. The episode was criticized at the time for treating environmental consciousness as equivalent to self-congratulation, and the criticism missed the point the show was actually making. The target was not environmentalism. It was the specific form of civic virtue that expresses itself as an identity rather than a practice, that treats the adoption of a correct attitude as equivalent to the work that the attitude is supposed to motivate. Randy did not reduce his emissions significantly. He bought a car that allowed him to feel that he had reduced his emissions significantly, and then he devoted the energy he might have spent on actual reduction to the enjoyment of his own moral position. That is the citizen the show keeps returning to across its entire run. The person who has outsourced their civic responsibility to a feeling, who experiences outrage as a form of participation and sympathy as a form of contribution, and the expression of correct values as a substitute for the actions those values would require. The town meeting is full of these people. They arrive furious and leave satisfied that they have done something, and the something they have done is attend a meeting and be furious, which is available to anyone and costs nothing and changes the town not at all. South Park has built its civic universe around this specific kind of civic failure because it is the most common kind, the failure that masquerades most successfully as its opposite, the version of not doing enough that feels, from the inside, exactly like like doing enough. The Naughty Ninjas episode made this argument with unusual precision by staging it as a sequence of choices, each one following logically from the last, until the sequence arrived at an outcome that exposed the logic underneath all of them. The adults of South Park decided they did not want their police force after Officer Barbrady shot a child. They organized a protest, and they meant it, and the outrage was genuine. Then the homeless population arrived near the Whole Foods, and the adults went back to the police and accepted the condition that nobody would watch what the police did to move the homeless along. The sequence took one episode. The moral position lasted until it became inconvenient, and the moment it became inconvenient, the adults found a way to maintain the position in public while abandoning it in practice, which is the most durable civic skill South Park's adult population has ever demonstrated. The financial crisis episode returned to this question from the economic direction. The town's residents had taken out mortgages and payment plans and credit arrangements they did not understand for products they may not have needed, and when the system that was supposed to manage those arrangements collapsed, they responded by treating the collapse as an external event, something that had happened to them from outside, a punishment from an economy they had no relationship to, rather than an outcome of choices they had made. Randy's austerity movement was the pure expression of this response, the public transforming its own financial behavior into a ritual of sacrifice directed at a force outside itself, because acknowledging the force inside itself was not a performance the town meeting was designed to support. The town's relationship with its own history is perhaps the deepest version of this failure. South Park has no institutional memory. The adults who organized the protest against Terrence and Philip in the first season are the same adults who organized the next protest and the one after that, and they carry nothing from one crisis to the next. No accumulating understanding of how these things tend to go. No skepticism produced by the memory of having been wrong before. Each new panic arrives in the town as though it were the first one, and the adults respond to it as though they had never responded to anything before, with the same intensity and the same certainty and the same complete absence of any mechanism for evaluating whether their response is proportionate or accurate. The show has staged this amnesia as comedy for 30 years, but the comedy has always had a precise target, which is the way civic amnesia allows corrupt institutions to reset alongside the public, to shed the accountability that the last scandal almost produced and begin fresh, because the public that might have imposed that accountability has already moved on to the next thing and cannot quite remember what the last thing was about. Gerald Broflovsky's trolling arc was the most intimate portrait the show has ever drawn of the citizen who is not merely passive in the face of institutional corruption, but actively contributing to it. Gerald was not in government or law enforcement or the entertainment industry. He was a private citizen, a lawyer, a father, a neighbor, a man with no formal institutional power whatsoever, and he was using the infrastructure of the new media landscape to do damage that was indistinguishable in its effects from the damage done by the institutions the show had spent years criticizing. The cruelty Gerald practiced online was not political in any coherent sense. It was not aimed at power or designed to expose wrongdoing. It was aimed at ordinary people, strangers with no more power than he had, targeted because they were available and because the anonymity of the network made the targeting costless. Gerald was not fighting corruption. He was adding to the sum of it from his home office, between putting his children to bed and going to sleep himself, as a hobby. The show used Gerald to make an argument that its portraits of institutions could not quite make, which is that corruption does not require an institution. It requires a person making a choice, repeatedly, in conditions that make the choice easy and its consequences invisible. Gerald had every advantage that an ordinary citizen is supposed to have over a corrupt institution. He had education and intelligence and a family he loved and a professional life built around the law. None of it prevented him from becoming, in the specific context that the internet provided, something that the show's corrupt officials and corporate executives would have recognized as a peer. The tools were different. The underlying choice was the same. The choice to use a position of relative power, however small, to do something to people who could not effectively resist it, and to continue making that choice, because the resistance never came. What the show has built across 30 years of its citizenry is not a portrait of a town victimized by its institutions, but a portrait of a town that has entered into a sustained and voluntary relationship with them, a relationship in which each party provides the other with what it needs to continue operating. The institutions provide the town with the appearance of governance, the feeling that something is being managed, the reassurance that there are people in charge of the things that are frightening. The town provides the institutions with the participation, the tax revenue, the electoral legitimacy, the willingness to show up at meetings and express concern and then go home without demanding anything that would be genuinely difficult to provide. side. The arrangement is corrupt in the technical sense that it fails to deliver what it promises, but it is also stable in the way that a bad marriage can be stable, held together not by any positive force, but by the shared understanding of both parties that the alternative requires more honesty than either of them is prepared to manage. The boys are outside this arrangement, or as close to outside as anyone in the show gets. They have not yet internalized the deal. They still ask why. They still notice when the explanation does not match the event. They still find it remarkable that the chickens fall on the game board is being used to decide where the money goes, because they have not spent enough time in the building to have accepted that as the way things are done. The show has always used their outsider position as the vantage point from which corruption becomes visible, and it has always been careful to note that the vantage point is temporary. The boys are getting older. The town has a way of incorporating the people who grow up inside it. The question South Park has never quite answered, and probably never will, is whether the boys will eventually become the adults who go to meetings and go home having changed nothing, or whether there is something in the vantage point that can be held onto, some form of the child's refusal to accept the explanation in place of the answer that survives the process of growing up in a corrupt town. The show does not know. It suspects the answer, the way it suspects most things it has spent 30 years looking at, but it has never been willing to say it out loud, because saying it out loud would require a certainty the program has never claimed to have. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The citizens of South Park sustain the corruption by choosing, again and again, the comfort of the arrangement over the difficulty of ending it. Next, in the final breakdown, every institution and every citizen comes together, and the show's 30-year argument about corruption resolves into a single question it has been building toward since the first episode, which is whether seeing clearly has ever been enough to change anything in a town built to resist that kind of seeing. Section 10. What seeing clearly costs. One thread has run underneath every institution and every citizen and every corrupt arrangement this breakdown has examined, so quietly that it is easy to mistake it for the scenery rather than the point. South Park can see. The show has demonstrated, across 30 years and more than 300 episodes, an extraordinary capacity for identifying the specific mechanism by which a given institution fails the people it claims to serve, for naming the gap between the explanation and the truth, for following the logic of a corrupt arrangement to its conclusion, and then staging that conclusion so the audience cannot look away from it. The headless chicken, the clenched teeth of Jesus, the sergeant who says out loud what the sergeant has always done, the media conglomerate whose money and whose muzzle arrive on the same afternoon. South Park sees all of it, and it sees it clearly, and it has been showing the audience what it sees for the better part of 3 decades. And the town is exactly as corrupt as it was in the first episode. That fact is the show's deepest and most uncomfortable statement about the relationship between satirical clarity and actual change, and it is a statement the show has never made directly, because making it directly would require the program to acknowledge something about its own function that is difficult to sit with. Satire, the argument goes, matters because it makes visible what power wants invisible, because the exposure of corruption is itself a form of accountability, because an audience that sees clearly is an audience capable of acting on what it sees. South Park has been making that argument implicitly for 30 years by continuing to produce episodes, by continuing to point the camera at the institutions and the arrangements and the citizens and the deals. The implicit argument is that the pointing matters. The town's continued corruption is the evidence against it. The boys are the show's most sustained attempt to hold on to the possibility that seeing matters. They have been the consistent moral witnesses of South Park across the entire run, the characters who notice what the adults have agreed not to notice, who ask the questions the adults have agreed not to ask, who arrive at the truth of things not through any special intelligence, but through the simple refusal to accept the comfortable version of events. Stan recognizes that the economy is not a god requiring sacrifice, and that the people in charge of it are using a dead chicken to make decisions. Kyle recognizes that the healthcare system is designed to deny rather than to treat, and that the design is the point. Kenny recognizes that his sister needs someone to show up for her, and that the someone is going to have to be him, because every institution above him in the chain has already broken. Cartman recognizes everything, and uses everything he recognizes to take what he wants, which is the dark mirror of the other's clarity, the same vision deployed in the service of the self rather than anything larger. What the boys cannot do, and what the show has never pretended they can do, is fix the town. Stan can deliver the speech about the economy, and Kyle can pay off the debts, and Kenny can put on the cape, and none of it changes the underlying arrangement that produced the problem. The debt gets paid, and Randy Randy buys another blender. The homeless get moved, and the deal that moved them stays in place. The corruption gets named, and the corruption continues, wearing the name without apparent discomfort. The boys clean up the mess and go back to school, and the town resets and produces the next mess. And the sequence has no end built into it, because the sequence is the show, and the show has been renewed. The self-awareness the program has developed about this loop has sharpened considerably across its later years. The You're Getting Old and Asperger's storyline in the 15th season was the show confronting its own structure directly. Sharon Marsh telling Randy that the same thing keeps happening, week after week, the same arguments, producing the same outcomes, nothing ever genuinely changing. The speech was directed at Randy, but it was delivered through the screen, and the audience heard it as the show talking about itself, acknowledging that the reset button exists, and that pressing it is a choice, and that the choice has consequences for what the show is capable of honestly claiming. A program that resets cannot claim to produce change. It can claim to produce clarity. The question the 15th season asked, and left open, was whether clarity alone is sufficient, or whether clarity that produces nothing is a different thing from clarity that produces something, and whether calling them both by the same word is itself a form of the comfortable falsehood the show spends its time exposing. The Sermon on the Mount episode in the 27th season was the most recent version of this confrontation, and it was the sharpest because it placed the show inside its own subject matter in a way that removed the last comfortable distance between the satire and the thing being satirized. Parker and Stone made an episode about institutional cowardice in the face of political power on the same day they signed a deal with the institution whose cowardice the episode was describing. The deal funded the episode. The episode mocked the deal. Both things were true at the same time, and the show's willingness to hold both things in the frame simultaneously was either the most honest thing it had ever done or the most sophisticated version of having it both ways, depending on how generously you read the gesture. The show was aware of this ambiguity. Jesus delivered the punchline about it through gritted teeth, warning the town that someone had backed down and that the consequences of backing down were now everyone's problem. The warning applied to Paramount. It also applied to South Park, which had taken Paramount's money and was using it to make the warning, and which would keep taking Paramount's money after the warning had been delivered and the episode had been filed and the next production cycle had begun. The corruption of South Park, the town, has always been a portrait of the corruption of South Park, the show, in the sense that both exist within systems they did not design and cannot escape and have decided to inhabit honestly rather than pretend to be outside. The town keeps its institutions because replacing them is harder than criticizing them. The show keeps its network deal because independence is harder than the deal. Neither the town nor the show is naive about this. The town goes to the meetings. The show makes the episodes. Both of them name the arrangements they are living inside, and both of them keep living inside those arrangements after the naming is done, because naming is what is available, and what is available is what gets used. What the 30 years of corruption satire have produced, taken together, is a portrait of power that is more honest than most, precisely because it refuses to locate the corruption in any single institution, or any single bad actor, or any single failure of oversight that could be addressed by the right reform. The corruption in South Park is systemic in the original sense of the word, built into the system, present at every level simultaneously, maintained by the participation of everyone who benefits from any part of the arrangement, even while objecting to other parts. The mayor is corrupt, and the police are corrupt, and the church is corrupt, and the corporation is corrupt, and the media is corrupt, and the financial system is corrupt, and the school is corrupt, and the citizens are corrupt, in the specific sense of having agreed to all of it, and the corruption of each institution is sustained by its relationship to the corruption of every other one, and the whole structure holds together because every party to it is getting something from it and is afraid of what the alternative might cost. The boys stand at the edge of this structure, as they have always stood, seeing it more clearly than anyone else in the town, and lacking the power to dismantle it, lacking even the certainty that dismantling it would produce something better, because the show has never been willing to promise that the alternative to a corrupt arrangement is a good one. The headless chicken fell on bailout. The next time, it might fall somewhere worse. The police were terrible, and when they left, the town descended into chaos in 48 hours. The entertainment industry constrains what can be said, and without the entertainment industry, the thing that needs saying has no platform. The corruption is real, and the alternatives the show has imagined are not obviously preferable, and the show has been honest about this in a way that its critics have sometimes mistaken for cynicism, and that is more accurately described as the specific honesty available to a program that has spent 30 years looking at the same town and refusing to pretend it has changed. Cartman is the figure in whom this honesty reaches its darkest form. He sees every arrangement in the town as clearly as any of of the boys, with more precision than most of them, and he uses that clarity not to resist the corruption, but to operate within it at maximum efficiency. Cartman is South Park's portrait of what seeing clearly looks like when it is fully separated from any obligation to do anything with the seeing. He understands how institutions work, and he uses that understanding to extract from them what he wants. He understands how people work, and he uses that understanding to manipulate them. He has never been confused about the nature of the town he lives in, and his complete absence of confusion has made him the most capable and the most dangerous person in it, the one who learned the lesson the show keeps teaching and drew from it precisely the wrong conclusion. The right conclusion, the one the show has been gesturing toward for 3 decades without ever stating it cleanly, is something quieter and less satisfying than either cynicism or optimism. It is the conclusion that Kyle keeps arriving at, episode after episode, in the moments when the show lets him be sincere. The conclusion is that seeing the arrangement clearly is not enough, and is also not nothing. That naming the corruption does not end it, and is also not the same as ignoring it. That living inside a system you cannot fix is not the same as consenting to it, and that the difference between the citizen who goes to the meeting and changes nothing and the citizen who does not go at all is a difference worth maintaining even when the outcome is identical. South Park has spent 30 years making that distinction between the clarity that produces nothing visible and the absence of clarity that produces something worse, and it has made the distinction in the only way available to a television program, which is by continuing to look at the thing and show the audience what it sees, week after week, season after season, in a town that stays corrupt and a show that stays on the air, and boys who keep showing up and asking why. The corruption will not end, the boys will not fix it, the town will reset, and the next institution will reveal itself, and the next arrangement will be named, and the deal that funds the naming will be signed on the same afternoon. South Park knows all of this, and has always known it, and it keeps making the episodes anyway, which is the show's answer to its own deepest question. Not because the answer is sufficient, because it is the one that is available, and because available, in a town built to resist every other kind, turns out to be enough. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.